Thank you very much to everyone for joining this webinar. You can see we have a few attendees so far, so it's just past the hour. So we're going to wait just a few minutes until we have a reasonable cohort of people joining, 38 now currently. So we'll wait just another second. Ahead of that, for anyone who's joined, I'd like to welcome you. Thank you for taking the time to join the session. We would like to let you know that this session is being recorded. There's also an opportunity to ask any questions, so please use the Q&A functionality there in Zoom. We'd also ask people to talk about the event, share any of your feedback or ideas on Twitter, so using our tag Scale Ireland and also the hashtag Startup Policy IRL. Again, we're going to wait another minute or so and then we'll kick off. As well as Judy Sinnamon from Enterprise Ireland, we also have Leo McAdams and Jenny Melia from Enterprise Ireland who'll be supporting and covering off any questions if there's any details that people want to get into. Okay, I think we have a reasonable amount of people to come. Some more may join and they can pick up as they join the session. So I'd like to welcome everyone to the COVID-19 Liquidity Supports for Innovative Enterprises webinar. Today, we are joined by Judy Sinnamon, the CEO at Enterprise Ireland. We'll also be hearing from Brian Caulfield. He's the chairperson at Scale Ireland. He's also a venture partner at Draper-Esprit. And I'll be moderating the session. I'm the CEO at Scale Ireland, Liz McCarthy. So in terms of what to expect, the agenda is here on the screen. For the first 5 minutes, I'm going to spend a little bit of time giving you an overview of what Scale Ireland is all about, and also an overview of the session and what kind of COVID response that we've been leading. Then I'll be followed by Julie Sinnamon, who will take 10 minutes to really give an overview of the Enterprise Ireland COVID response. Brian Caulfield then will take 10 minutes to explain his perspective on the impact that COVID has had on startup ecosystems globally, from the investor environment right through to the startups and the type of challenges startups are facing. And then we'll have our prepared Q&A, which will be moderated by myself for around 20 minutes. So that's our pre-prepared questions that are picking up on some of the research that we've had over the last few months in our previous engagement with Enterprise Ireland. And we'll also be using some questions that we've had from the community over the last few weeks. And then we'll also have time for the moderated Q&A. So like I said, if you have any questions, please do add them in the Q&A chat, and we'll pick up on as many as we possibly can. And there'll be closing remarks and wrap up. Quick session, and thanks again for joining. So to start, I'd like to give a bit of background to Scale Ireland if you're new to the organisation, and a bit of an understanding as to what we've been doing since COVID began. So initially starting with our organisation objective. So we set this organisation up to respond to the need that we'd identified in the startup community, where there was a real strong belief that Ireland's startups need a more supportive policy environment. However, to date, the startup ecosystem had not really been well represented. There was no structured professional organisation to effectively provide a representative voice, and that was really building on research-based advocacy to advocate for policy change. On the other hand, as many in the startup community know, we really have a really strong belief that Ireland has the opportunity to reshape enterprise policy to position the country globally as a great place to scale innovation-driven startups. Now, again, that's not to say that everything needs to be thrown out. There's been really, really great work done over many years that has led to some really good success. But we believe that as a country and from a political perspective, we can really have a greater focus on this sector to do even more. So essentially, that is the objective of Scale Ireland, to provide this independent professional policy voice for Ireland's startup ecosystem, to provide a bridge with government, not only from the ecosystem to government, but equally from government to the ecosystem. It's a two-way street. So to set off, in any presentation we've ever done in Scale Ireland, we've always talked about who do we actually represent? What is a startup? And we've been using these two graphs quite a lot. It's something that we found from MIT, which was actually flagged to us by one of our partners, Portershed, who've done a lot of work with that university over in America. And what they do is they talk about traditional SMEs, the graph on the left. So they're SMEs where they've a kind of more linear cash flow generated over time. They're typically servicing a local market, and they're typically able to generate positive cash flow. And in practical terms, that generally means that they're actually able to have a good conversation with the bank manager and maybe access things like debt from a bank. And they're, again, servicing a local market and sometimes offering a kind of replicative business model. Whereas in contrast, the startups and scale-ups that we're talking about in this session today are innovation-driven enterprises. They have a different type of cash flow curve over time, kind of a J curve, where they're investing heavily upfront in innovation. Now, that innovation may well be a new business model, or it may be a new product, and investing heavily in R&D. And that means that they're loss-making in the early days with a view to positive growth in later years. And it's that J curve that really causes a lot of challenges for those companies to access the kind of liquidity that they need. And in a time like a COVID crisis, there's specific types of supports that they need, and that causes various types of challenges that we'll be getting into later. So in terms of Scale Ireland, an important part of our growth was the setting up of our steering group. So this is a snapshot of the type of companies that have, the type of people who've been backing us and supporting us from day one. They represent quite broad sector from across the whole country, and different sectors, medtech through to digital, but also different type of expertise. So tax experts, legal experts, the VC industry, as well as startup founders at different stages. For us, as we set out on this path, we were coming from within the startup ecosystem, and we were trying to figure out how could we actually set up an organization that could sustain, given the transient nature of the startup ecosystem, where many member companies would likely not have significant budget to go to pay towards this professional body voice. So what we've done is we followed a kind of social movement approach to setting up an organization, a representative organization. So phase one essentially was the emergence that started back in October 2018. Along with Conor Goolsbury, who had experience from within government, he and I ran a project within Dogpatch Labs to really set out and see, was there feasibility in setting up a new organisation? What was the best way of providing a voice for startups? At that time, we engaged with Enterprise Ireland, Department of Business and others to really see what would be the best way of setting that up, among others. The second phase for us was essentially much of last year, where we were coalescing. We had some founding funders, for example, to help us do our work and to do some policy advocacy and really shape the organisation in a way that it could sustain. We were moving then towards this institutionalization phase. So it was phase 3, 2020. So as COVID hit, we had started institutionalizing. We'd set up a not-for-profit CLG. We were setting up our governance structures. We have a board in place, a founding board, and we were looking to set up policy committees, etc. And of course, COVID hit. I'll talk about that in a moment. But I'd just like to note here that developing a representative body is a long-term project. That's something that is, often we want a quick win, but it is a case of setting up something that can have a constructive relationship with government and really be at the table. Some context that's useful to consider there is, for example, the Irish Vintners Association, which is a really strong voice. They were established back in 1817, so they've been around quite a long time. They have very strong established relationships with government. Equally, IFA, established back in 1955. So this is a long-term project to set up a body that can have a seat in government. Then, of course, COVID hit, so we pivoted like many others, anyone else in the economy. So a snapshot of some of the work that we've been doing since March. We spent some time sharing resources, signposting people to government. We set up our startup supports tracker to try and assess what is out there, what can people take access to, and what kind of maybe challenges in accessing supports, feeding that through then to the right people in government. We've also engaged, we've created policy submissions, we've made proposals, we really dug in particular around liquidity supports, something that again Brian will speak to later and we'll talk about with Leo, Jenny and Julie later in the session. We've also been active at an EU level. We engaged with the EU around state aid rules. Again, it's something we might cover off briefly later. It is something that does impact on all member states in terms of what the government can do to support these innovative companies. We were involved in driving a PR campaign in that respect. We've also been engaging with founders, so throughout trying to support founders in as much as we can, again with very limited resources. We then, in June, and kindly with the support of people like Sophie Reynolds and Dave Cunningham from Galway, who's been doing incredible work, working very closely with founders to try and understand and dig into what the challenges are, and then feed that through to agencies, for example, Enterprise Ireland. And within that work, we've also set up a founders group on LinkedIn, 180 members at the moment. So if you're not a member of that, please do join. And then finally, an example of the work we've been doing is engaging regularly with Enterprise Ireland, really trying to, again, be that channel for feedback Are there challenges? Are there maybe issues that we've identified through our feedback, our engagement with our members, and then feeding that through? And this is a really good example of Enterprise Ireland equally opening the door and sharing candidly the types of work that they've been doing, some of the challenges that they're facing, and providing a kind of constructive engagement with the community through questions and answers. So with that, I'd like to hand over to Julie, who will give an overview of the Enterprise Ireland COVID response.
Thanks, Liz, and good afternoon, everybody. And thanks for the opportunity to address so many of you today. I'm not going to spend very long in terms of introducing Enterprise Ireland. I assume that you're all well aware of who we are, but our key focus is to support Irish companies to start and to scale, and hence our objectives mirror very much Scale Ireland in terms of wanting to make sure that we have a strong cohort of Irish innovative companies of scale going forward. Just in putting some numbers of those, over the last 10 years, we would have supported about 1,000 high potential startup companies and investing about 122.5 million in those companies. And each year we go through a large amount of work. We would have worked last year with about 1,400 companies, and at the end of the day, we would have supported 91 of those high potential startup companies. In my view, startups are the lifeblood of any economy, and hence we are really anxious to make sure that post-COVID-19 we end up with a strong cohort of technology-based companies, and that's the key objective. Just in terms of our a very brief overview in terms of what we're seeing on the impact of COVID. Obviously, the immediate impact on many of our companies has been the loss of sales for some companies. A lot of global markets, depending on the sector and the region, have been substantially impacted. Slowdown in customers paying for products and services. So again, that has had a cash flow impact. Sales prospects being on hold, and customer trials for some of the early stage companies being halted, which has had a big impact on some of our companies. And obviously, against that backdrop, for many of the young innovative companies, the key challenge is holding on to the staff that you have. Talent is critical, and that's something that we would be very concerned about. So just in response to that, we have, and it still is not clear what the full impact of COVID will be, because that will depend on the rate of recovery of many of those markets. Secondly, in terms of the wage subsidy scheme that was brought in by government, there's 57,000 companies that are actually accessing the wage subsidy scheme at present, and in many ways it is masking some of those short-term problems. And I know there have been some issues with regard to higher paid employees not being eligible for it, but still a lot of early stage and technology companies are accessing those wage subsidy schemes. So it's against that backdrop that Enterprise Ireland has been working very closely to develop our suite of COVID supports, and those go right from planning grants right through to putting liquidity support in the companies. One of the things we would have discovered in the 2011-12 crisis was for many companies they didn't have the resources internally to put together a plan for their company. This isn't just a plan to access funding from Enterprise Ireland. This is a plan for the future funding of the company. And we have 100% grant support available for companies, €5,000. Massive support, massive reaction from companies in terms of the relevance of this as a first step in helping companies if they don't have those resources in-house. We have over 500 applications to date, and it's a pretty quick turnaround time of 2 or 3 days. So that's something which is the first step. For some companies, it's about lean business continuity, and again, a very, it's a 2,500 grant. It is 100% support, and that can help companies to bring in relevant advisory support. And then the key support available has been through the Sustaining Enterprise Fund. And there's a number of different programs paying out between 25 and 800,000 to companies depending on their need and their stage of development. To date, with 51 applications in-house, 21 of which have been approved. In fact, with another 2 substantial ones approved this morning. So it's something which the numbers have been relatively low to date, not any lower than I would have expected, because most of the companies, with 100 companies currently putting together applications, and all of those have typically been supported through the financial planning grant. So those pipelines will build. And of course, we had our normal range of supports, and for many companies, those supports are innovation supports and supports for through the HPSU scheme as well. Liz mentioned EU state aid guidelines, and a lot of work for Leo and the team in the last couple of months has been working with the EU initially to get a temporary framework in place, and then to put together our schemes and get EU approval to run the various schemes. I think one of the areas that has come up a number of times is one of the conditions in that scheme is that a company can't be an undertaking in difficulty. I suppose the key message, and one of the messages I'd be keen to convey today to make sure everybody's absolutely clear, that is a constraint. It's part of the EU state aid guidelines. But of all the applications that we have had in and all the discussions we've had at this stage, it hasn't blocked us from being able to support any company. So it does mean we have to do it in a different way. It does damage our ability to communicate the simplicity of it if we had just a carte blanche to do it all through the same scheme. But at the end of the day, there are other mechanisms available, and we are very anxious to talk to companies who have funding needs and to be able to help them. We're acutely aware of the pressures, and we want to make sure that those supports are available. So I'm going to leave it at that, Liz, to allow time, plenty of time for questions, and I'll hand it over to you, and we'll come back in later.
Great, thank you. I might hand it over now to Brian Caulfield, who again will give his perspective from the startup ecosystem and what's happening. And thanks, Sarah. We're going to start my video, but we can head straight over to Brian, I think, to talk from that perspective.
Thanks, Liz. So firstly, I'd just like to start by thanking Julie and the rest of the Enterprise Ireland team for, so to speak, coming into the lion's den this morning. So thanks very much for that, Julie. I mean, Julie has already mentioned that kind of in the situation that we're in, there are a number of challenges for companies. The first challenge is, if you like, that kind of revenue and customer challenge where people either don't get a flow of new orders, business dries up, or maybe they're still doing business but they're having difficulty getting paid. And it's probably fair to say that there are kind of different categories of company in that respect. That there are the ones that are in the eye of the storm, if you like, who perhaps are in the travel sector or serve retail customers, and they've been immensely badly affected. I mean, I'm aware of one company whose revenue has literally dropped by 97%. So those companies felt it very quickly and very, very badly. You also have kind of, if you like, normal companies, and for them, they've probably been through a period where they saw no new orders for a period of time, and where they are seeing orders, they're smaller and they're struggling to get paid. And then there's a tiny number of companies for whom there's significant upside. Companies that are virtualizing a physical interaction, etc. But there's frankly very, very few companies that are in the category of, for example, a Zoom or somebody who's selling surgical masks. So those are really very, very rare. Just perhaps to mention pre-revenue companies. for them, it's all about when they last raised money. And that kind of brings me to the second issue for companies. Not only have they seen a reduction in customer revenue, but they've also seen a world in which it has become much, much more difficult to raise money. And is likely to stay that way for potentially a prolonged period of time. And, just to maybe talk a little bit about some of the issues there. I mean, firstly, if you are VC funded, most VCs right now, what they're doing is focusing very much on the survival of their existing portfolio. They're sitting down with companies in their portfolio to understand where they stand, what are their likely future capital requirements, how hard is it going to be for them to raise that capital externally, and what is the survival plan for those businesses. In many cases, that means that they're reallocating capital from new deals to existing portfolio. And, as a result of that, it makes it harder to raise money externally. The other impacts on, let's say, the VC investment sector is that the time to raise a fund will likely lengthen significantly. So new funds coming to the market will be few and far between as LPs in turn slow down their decision making. So it's not that new deals stop completely, but they definitely slow down pretty significantly. If you're, on the other hand, angel funded, I suppose for angels, the key concerns are sort of, if you like, fear and liquidity. So, just fear about what's going to happen and whether they're prepared to risk more capital in that environment. Fear in terms of whether their existing companies are going to require more capital and do they need to preserve capital for them. And then just concerns, for example, if what they were doing was investing profits from an existing business and those profits dry up, well, then they start to worry about their ability to fund anything in the future. So these are the reasons, if you like, that a government response is so essential. And I think it's fair to say that the requirement for that government response has been recognised everywhere around Europe. We've seen, very strong action in Germany and the UK and certainly France, a variety of different initiatives that we don't really have time to go into now. I think, it's impossible to sort of overemphasize the importance of government response here. I also want to kind of emphasize that this is not, if you like, a bailout of private capital. This is a scenario where businesses have essentially been closed by decree due to a public health crisis. So, this shouldn't be seen in the context of a bailout of anyone. In terms of the response that's needed, I think there are a number of things. Firstly, there's the short-term liquidity supports, and Julie has talked a little bit about those. I'd break those down into two categories, essentially kind of debt-type instruments and equity instruments. Very important to keep the equity instruments simple, and we've proposed a bridge funding a fund effectively based on convertible loan notes to facilitate quick decision making. The second thing then is looking after the existing VC funds and potentially topping up those VC funds to enable them to continue to support their existing portfolios. The third thing is driving additional private capital into the market, encouraging people to put their savings to work by investing in startups. So we'll be very focused on, further reforms to the IIS scheme to encourage people to put private capital into the market. Finally, I just wanted to wrap up by saying that we absolutely recognize as an organization that there are significant constraints here. I mean, ultimately, there obviously is a financial constraint. Beyond that, as Julie has mentioned, in spite of rumours to the contrary, EU state aid rules haven't gone away, as they say. Both the undertaking in distress issue and the market participant principle are kind of key things that limit the ability of governments right across Europe to do certain things. And unfortunately, in Ireland, we also face a further challenge in terms of just the absence of a government at present. I mean, essentially anything that requires legislation is shall we say challenging at the moment. So we do operate in a constrained environment. So that's a quick tour of the situation as we see it, broadly speaking. And with that, I'll hand back to Liz.
Thank you very much, Brian. I think, unfortunately, it's been a quick run through everything. This could take many webinar series to talk about the variety of different complex factors that are interacting, leading to the situation that we're in. But right now, I think this is the opportunity to ask questions, like I said, that we have heard from the community, and also based on our research and our founder engagement, to really understand, are there kind of system changes that can be made or adjustments to instruments to make sure that the money can flow to more organizations and quicker. To start, I'll point to Julie first of all. I'd like to say that SEF as an instrument is the instrument that we've had the most queries about. And we've been when engaging with founders, there's been an interest in using and leveraging that in the way that it's been described. There's quite a lot of interest in accessing repayable advance at that 4% administrative cost. So what we understand, as Brian had said, there's some constraints for EI. This is a crisis, and that many of the people on this call are in a crisis, and every day and every hour matters a lot to these very small early stage or even later stage companies where time is of the essence. And so we're really keen to help make sure that the money actually moves through the system and gets into the hands of these companies as quickly as possible. And I would like to note again, the easiest thing for Enterprise Ireland and for you to do would be to just not be open to taking part in a call like this. And, we're going to address some tough issues in this conversation, and we do respect that you're open to having an open and fair dialogue and to take questions from the community. We think it's really, really important. So when it comes to SEF and the similar schemes, some of the kind of things that have been coming through in our engagement with people are first and foremost the application process. So earlier you mentioned that where things are at in relation to SEF as that scheme, that you would expect that there would be around about the number of applications in process right now, given that you are requiring, for example, people to have a suitable business plan in place, which is a reasonable thing to expect when people are looking for money. However, it is a crisis period, and we would be concerned that maybe the systems in place are maybe not a good fit for the number of applications that are coming in because of the pandemic that has caused such a problem for so many companies at once through no fault of their own. So in our structured founder engagement, 40 of the companies said that the application process was complicated, there was lack of clarity. First of all, in dealing with, for example, going through the SBCI process and trying to access bank debt, there was lack of clarity from the pillar banks, and then lack of clarity on whether they could actually start the SEF application process in parallel with that process of clarifying they couldn't get any other liquidity. So again, in essence, the recommendation would be that the process should be made quicker. Can you speak to that, or equally Leo or Jenny, if you can contribute? what are your thoughts on maybe potential changes that can be made to make that application process quicker so that more companies can move through the system for that repayable advance?
Okay, thanks, Liz. And certainly, and I'll kick off, and then I might bring Jenny and Leo in on that. But at the end of the day, what we have set as an absolute outside target here is from an application comes into us until the money is in the bank account is 20 days. And to be honest, and we have been delivering on that. So it isn't that applications are sitting, that there are delays in Enterprise Ireland. So when I said that I felt that the fact that there was 50 plus applications in at present and 100 being prepared, that I'm only reflecting the fact that we've been in touch with about 2,000 companies over the last number of weeks. We've been talking to those about their liquidity issues. A lot of those companies, which would reflect some of the feedback we've got from yourselves, is saying that over the next number of months, they will require money. But actually, there are other priorities at this point in time. They aren't on a critical list in terms of wanting to get an application in today, but they've indicated they will be putting an application in. So I certainly see that things like the wage subsidy scheme have been extremely beneficial in providing access to cash in the short term. But there's been a lot of misinformation, which is why I'm really happy to be here today to have this conversation in terms of the process. And it's why our advice to people is you come and you talk to your development advisor. For most technology companies, I would say that they are not, they don't get funded by the banks. It's venture capital and business angels that are funding them. So we're not putting those companies into FBCI before they come in to talk to EI. That isn't the process. I mean, the development advisor is working with them. They're putting an application in. They're seeing what the best way to support them is. And we're actually getting those projects through the process as quickly as possible. And I'm going to hand over to Jenny just to give some of the specifics and also feedback from companies who've gone through that process.
So, afternoon, everyone. Liz, I'll talk a little bit about the SEF offer that we developed specifically for the HPSU clients to address liquidity challenges. And so this offer was turned around over a couple of weeks and was launched at the end of April, the start of May. And the kind of timeline we're looking at there, I'll give you an example. From when an application comes into us to when it goes through its approval and so on, and we get the legals issued, we're using a CLN. So great that actually meets in terms of what Brian was saying, the need for a simple instrument and one that can be turned around quickly. But we're looking at 14 days there from when the application hits the desk in Enterprise Ireland to like I said, when it goes through approval and when legals are issued. And it was deliberately designed to move quickly because we are conscious of the challenges for the startups. It was put in place to provide funding of roughly 3 to 6 months so that the companies can get their new plans together and can be well positioned to go and raise further investment. And look, in terms of raising investment, we all know it's not a fast thing to do. You are typically looking at its best a 6 to 9 month period, usually when you're talking to the VCs in terms of raising investment. Around our HPSU portfolio, we're probably talking, going back to Brian's conversation, probably talking predominantly business angels. And so we're working very closely with our colleagues there in HVAN and our colleagues in the business incubation centres around the country in terms of helping the companies update their plans and prep for further investment.
Can I just add 2 points to that? Number one, the 50,000 HPSU offer isn't a ceiling of money available for those companies. For some of the startups in Jenny's side, they need more than 50k. So the 50k is just a simple offer to bridge companies. Most of the companies, that the feedback we got was that 50k fast offer would actually be of benefit, but they're equally eligible for larger amounts of money if they're needed. And the second point here is that those in some cases, the company hasn't been able to get any additional funding from their other sources of funding, be it business angels, venture funds, for the reasons that Brian has mentioned. For some of those venture funds, they're focusing, or they just don't have the funding available to support the companies. And in those cases, Enterprise Ireland is the only person writing a check, and we've been prepared to do that. So the risk level that we are going to, not just for the existing portfolio, but for some of those startup companies where we're going in for the first time, we're equally more flexible on that matched funding than we otherwise would have been. So I think it's important that we're just clear that you don't always need that matched funding. If there are reasons why it isn't available, we're quite happy to be the only person writing a check. And actually, to the point that Brian made with regard to the VC not having funding available, we currently are working, and it'll be finalised over the next few weeks, to top up a number of our venture capital funds to make sure that there's more funding available for the existing portfolio, and with another number of funds that are coming in stream. So the funding issue, it isn't just about EI putting funding in. We need to make sure that business angels, and I certainly would endorse what Brian's saying about needing to find ways to bring more private capital into the market. Certainly when you hear the figures of the saving that people are doing, there is a lot of money sitting in bank accounts that we think could be freed up pretty quickly to get it into companies. So that's something that we would share your view on.
And I think that's something, again, at a political level, the EIIS making that working properly to try and drive their private capital into this ecosystem will be important throughout 2020. Maybe touching on that point, again, it's the second point that was pre-prepared, was around the size of companies. So many of the people we've engaged with who've really expressed concern or saying they can't access supports are companies that employ less than 10 people. Now, these companies may well actually be employing people as consultants or on a consultancy basis, so they don't have a large amount of full-time salaried employees. But essentially, there's a lot of companies that are that size that feel that there isn't really a suitable funding mechanism available to them. Maybe for whatever reason that convertible loan note you just talked about, maybe they're not aware of it. Maybe there's some feelings that maybe that's particularly targeted at existing HPSU clients. Maybe they've never raised money before, so they're not in that space. And essentially, a lot of those companies would really be very interested in applying for and ideally accessing the SEF as a repayable advance rather than needing to get match equity funding. Is it possible to amend SEF to enable companies with less than 10 employees to apply?
Okay, so first of all, the SEF is focused on companies employing greater than 10. However, if you go to Jenny's side and the innovative aid, which is how she is supporting 90% of the startups, they don't have 10 employees. The bulk of the companies that Jenny is dealing with have less than 10 employees. So one of the reasons I'm keen to get the message out, we have a COVID-19 business response hub, which is taking calls. So far, they've about 3,700 calls from companies. Less than half of those companies would be EI employees, and what they're doing is directing them to the appropriate source of support. In some cases, it's the local enterprise office. In some cases, it's with the HPSU team. In some cases, it's Microfinance Ireland. So my advice to anybody who has a funding need is contact, if they have a development advisor, their development advisor. Whether they've 10 people or not 10 people, they should contact their development advisor if they're an EI client, or they should contact their local enterprise office or the COVID-19 hub in Enterprise Ireland. They're all there trying to support companies and direct them to the appropriate types of support. But that, the bulk of Jenny's companies do not have 10 employees. So we don't need to change. Like, once you start changing criteria, what we have found is of every company that has come into us, we have been able to respond within the existing instruments. So it's just to make sure that that message gets out here today.
Sorry, can I come in there for a sec, Liz? So just to be super clear for any HPSUs that we have here with us today, whether you're above 10 or below 10, it makes no difference. Whether you're creating revenues or you're pre-revenue, it makes no difference. In terms of the match funding, we will encourage you to leverage the Enterprise Ireland funding as much as possible and get as much out of your investors as you possibly can to give yourself the best financial runway. But like Julie says, you know, we are being flexible in the current situation, and we have cases gone through over the last couple of weeks where the promoters who are working with business angels weren't able to bring a full 50K to the table, and it didn't stop us processing those approvals. So the one thing we are needing to see is that we have a viable company. This isn't funding for every HPSU that's out there. This is for HPSUs with viable business plans and where we have a lot of market disruption. That's why it's so important that the companies get a strong strategic plan together. And we've about 130 applications now approved for financial planning grants for our HPSU.
On that note, I might actually pass it over to Brian to cover off a question that has been, you know, that we've raised it with yourselves previously. It's around that process of creating a business plan that's a good fit for Enterprise Ireland in order to get this relatively small amount of money. You know, if you've got quite a big burn rate, there's a lot that you need to do. Some of the concern has been that they've had to go through the process of being approved for a 5K grant in order to access third-party consultancy services and then to work with an outsider to create a plan. Brian, maybe you might cover off the specific question and then we'll hand over to you. Again, we don't want to have confusion, so we want to get clarity from your end. What's required? What's the best process so people can move through as quickly as possible?
So I mean, I think you've summed it up there, Liz. I mean, I think one of the concerns that people have expressed is that in some cases the consultants that have been appointed have not had a huge amount of insight into the types of businesses that they're working with, and it's been felt that people have struggled to get those advisors to really develop a deep understanding of the business. So I think that has been a concern. But Julie, I know you wanted to come in on that.
I'm very happy to come into the line then, Brian, to clear up some misinformation. So firstly, the financial planning grant is an option that is available to companies who want to get the support of a consultant, be it a consultant on a list that we have of consultants that have done work with other companies, which we have been happy with in terms of their ability to deliver the need. But for many companies, they've got their own financial consultant, and so it doesn't need to be somebody. If companies have a gap and they need support, the funding is there at 100%. To encourage those companies to take on support. But actually, other companies have come straight into the Sustaining Enterprise Fund without using the financial planning grant. So they're not sequential. It's there as an optional extra. Actually, the feedback that we have got from a lot of consultants working with companies is that the amount of work being required to work with these companies because they don't have a plan, and that it's taking longer than they might have expected to get the company up. And the feedback from companies is it has really helped them. They didn't know what they didn't know and they didn't have a plan. But you don't have to use the consultant. That is an option. If companies want that support, it's available. Leo, I see you trying to say something there.
Yeah. So listen, I think that's important. And when we were designing the 5K grant, we were obviously very conscious from talking to the companies that a number of companies had their own external consultants that know the business really well. And those companies, exactly what you're saying, Brian, didn't want to particularly go and engage with other consultants that would not have known the business and would have had to educate themselves. So for that reason, there's an option that if you don't have somebody that you feel has the expertise to carry out a financial analysis and develop a plan, we have a panel. And what we do is we go back to you as a company with 3 financial experts, and you decide on one of them. That's the first thing. And if you do not want to use our panel, well, then you come into us with your recommended service provider expert. And we just very quickly go through a list of criteria to ensure they're qualified. And then we sign off and you can use that consultant. And as Julie has said, like in terms of the volume of companies now that are coming to us looking for that service, like we've over 500 applications in, and over like a significant number of those are actually from HPSUs. So we understand the relevance and the importance of it to all sectors and to all stages of growth.
They don't need to use a consultant. It isn't a required step, and it isn't to prepare a plan for EI. Right? So that is the fact that there is the ability for companies to take on that expertise has given rise, well, it must be a really difficult process if you need to take on a consultant for 5 days to do it for you. This is about helping companies put together a plan which they will use for their own benefit to access further funding from their business angels or their venture capital funds, etc. So it is not to put together an application for Enterprise Ireland.
That's really helpful. And we're quickly...
Just to finish on that, the feedback we got from 10 years ago, during the first global financial crisis, from banks, VCs, funders, was that companies were coming to them and they didn't have the information or the right financials in order to present their case and to get funding. So as soon as middle of March hit, and we understood that there was going to be a lockdown and a crisis, it was the first product we worked on to get out the door. So in terms of, as I said, all stages of growth and especially the startup community, it is an excellent product, and we would encourage your members that haven't availed of it to avail of it. So it is not, as Julie said, aimed to bring companies back into EI. That obviously is an option, and we are seeing that, but it is also to help companies to engage with banks, to engage with VCs, and to engage with other sources of funding.
And Leo, can I just, again, to clarify for people who are on the call, that it is open to all of the clients we have in the HPSU unit, whether they're post-HPSU, as in we have an investment there, or whether they're in our early stage pipeline. And I can certainly say on behalf of the HPSU clients that most of them have used their own consultants, because a lot of work was done, like Leo says, to validate consultants.
I'm going to have to move us on from this point. Apologies, Jenny. And I think this just speaks to the fact that there is some, again, confusion and different things have been heard in different times. And there's an opportunity for us to kind of get clarity, hear the feedback, channel it back again. So I think there could possibly be interest in more of this clarifications coming back to the community, perhaps via us, if helpful. So just to summarize on that point, the confusion was there, but people do not need an external consultant. They can work with someone they've already been working with. They can draw it down in that way. And then also in the first point is that companies at less than 10 can apply for funding under the SEF HPSU. They don't need to have matched funding in place necessarily, but if they can possibly show that they've tried to get it, that it will be very, very strong. And they don't have to be existing HPSU clients in order to be able to...
Sorry, now, Liz, just before any more information goes out into the system that confuses people, that is for existing HPSUs. So the reason we can turn that around so quickly is because we already have a shareholders agreement in place there. We have a relationship with the company. For our pre-seed companies, we have our competitive start fund. We recently closed a call and we're just getting ready now to launch the second call. We are using a lot of feasibility funding to help them address some of the issues they have. And we're working very closely with HBAN and the Incubation Centre.
again, I think that's something that we're going to be moving to Q&A right now from the community. And I think this just shows that there is definitely a need and an interest in, there's a huge kind of take up on this webinar and interest in just hearing directly what the situation is. Is there an opportunity for bringing in instruments to meet a gap? And there's definitely a gap that we've identified for companies with less than 10 employees who can't access SEF main fund or SEF for small business, which at the moment it says it's for companies with 10 or more employees. And there's companies with less than that who feel there is nowhere to go if they're not an existing HPSU client. So again,
can I suggest that we would like to get some specifics from those, because there also is the local enterprise offices who deal with companies up to 10, and Enterprise Ireland deals with companies over 10, and then there's Microfinance Ireland. So I think the easiest way to understand, is there a gap, because I don't know if there is a gap or not, is to get some specifics as to what the companies are, who they are. There could be some companies that could be potential HPSUs. There could be companies that are relevant for the local enterprise office, etc. So we'd like to talk about some of those specifics, and I'd suggest that we might have that conversation offline subsequently.
Yeah, I think that would be really, really helpful, because it's a gap that we've definitely identified. Now, we do have 6 minutes left, and we've committed to finishing at 2, so we will do so. But again, I think it really does point to the value of having this direct channel, possibly moderated, because there's been confusion on various fronts. So I've got the questions in front of me. I've got 15 questions have come in from the community. I think what we'll do, just in case your question isn't answered, what we will do is we'll compile all these. We can also share them with the EI team. The relevant people who can really provide a proper answer can come out with that, and we can share that in whatever format makes sense, be it a video or a blog or an article, to make sure that we are sharing this information. So please do open emails from us after this. We'll be sharing information following on from this. So the first one I'd like to cover off. So I'm just reading this directly. It was flagged to me. So Julie mentioned they have approved 21 of the 51 applications for funding so far. This person would like to know, what are the main characteristics of those that were successful in raising debt? And equally, what are the main reasons for rejecting companies?
None of those. The difference between the 21 and the 51 is effectively applications that are currently being processed. So we haven't, I'm not sure whether we have rejected any cases as yet. I'm not aware of any rejections, right? So again, this is, and why we're really keen to get the word out that there are supports available, and and we have not yet rejected one application. And in fact, in some cases where we've had business as usual companies going to our investment committee, the investment committee have been saying to the DA, you really should be going back to that company and getting them to put in an application for the SEF on top of this. So, I mean, there are supports available, and we haven't rejected any. And the characteristics, the one thing which all of these have, they're vulnerable but viable. So in all cases, we have to see that the company has a plan, and in as much as anything is possible at present, that we believe that they have the potential to get back on track at some stage in the future.
And Liz, just if I could add to that, in terms of what we talked about, the undertaking in difficulty. So just to be clear, there are companies that do not, because of EU state aid, qualify for the SEF because of undertaking in difficulty. However, we have other supports that we are using to support those companies that are not eligible. So they may not be supported under SEF, but they will be supported under our other supports. So I think that's a message that your members really need to understand.
That's why our word is talk to your development advisor, because actually, that will determine the type of support that we feel is best for you.
Okay, great. And I think this is where, we've heard really genuinely, really, really strong positive feedback about the development advisors who seem to be working, and they have huge caseloads and a huge amount to be dealing with. And so that's where, if there's a way of accelerating the system and automating or making information available so it doesn't have to be channeled through those people, those individuals, that's something we would really recommend. Now there are many, many more questions that are coming through, and I think that we'll regroup after this, and I think there'll be maybe potential merit in maybe hosting a follow-on this to continue the conversation and again to share that information. But we're going to have to wrap up for today because it has come close to 2:00. Before we do, I might hand over to Brian, who I think he seemed to have something to say, but maybe I'm reading him wrong.
No, I was just going to say, Liz, that what might be useful is to take the list of questions and perhaps we can work with EI on responses to those and maybe even circulate those by email, because there's a number of very, very specific questions that we can probably give reasonably straightforward, concrete answers to. Perhaps not all of them, but definitely some of them, and a kind of an email to everybody, and maybe a document that we can post on the Scale Ireland website based on those questions might well be useful, given we are running out of time.
Absolutely. And again, we videoed this. We'll be sharing this and sharing snapshots of it to try and get those clear messages out so that people are not confused and we're sending the right message of how to engage. And hopefully, again, having a strong feedback loop, like with anyone who's in the startup world, listening, user feedback, adapting, upgrading, things are rolled out quickly. And it's a case of just making sure there's continuous improvement baked in. So I'd like to move to finishing. So I'd really like to thank you for your time. Genuinely, there's an awful lot of work going on behind the scenes within Enterprise Ireland. Now, like with any of us, there's always room for improvement in anything any of us do. So it's a case of just making sure that we work with each other, provide the feedback into Enterprise Ireland directly, into Scale Ireland. We are here to try and help channel that as well. Please do engage. If there's engagement, it's easier to identify and solve any problems. This wasn't meant to be a lion's den, but rather a nature of us being a representative body to...
That was your word.
Yeah, to bring forward the views and issues raised by founders. And, we would like to recognise, I don't think any of us would envy your jobs right now. I think there is a huge amount of work to be done. It's a case of working together, and hopefully we all are passionate about Ireland's economy coming out of this and developing our Indigenous innovation economy. So working together is the way to achieve that.
Can I just one last word? I mean, the one thing that I want to make sure everybody listening here today is there are a suite of funds available. If anybody has funding needs, please come to us, because we really want to engage. And if through that engagement we find there are gaps, we want to make sure we address those gaps. So be it us or somebody else, come to us with any funding needs, and we want to be able to address them.
And equally, come through to us if you're concerned with any challenges and you need to raise them. We are here as that body to be able to take in that feedback and channel it through and try and address problems. So on that note, I'd like to thank everyone. Thank you, Brian, for your time as always. I'd like to thank behind the scenes, in particular, Sarah Walker, who's actually been given to us by Dogpatch Labs, because we didn't have a marketing resource. Scale Ireland is a very tightly resourced organisation. Sophie Reynolds behind the scenes doing incredible work, and Dave Cunningham from Galway, who's so passionate about the development of Ireland's startup ecosystem. He's just been incredible and has been helping me on some of my, on many, many fronts. So look, we have to work together. We're all really passionate about Ireland's Indigenous innovation ecosystem surviving and growing. So hopefully this can be part of that.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. Well done.
Okay.
Thank you.
See you. Bye.
Bye.